Hello, and thank you for joining us. I would like to welcome you to today's TechNet webcast, 24 Hours of Exchange Server 2007. This is part 2 of 24, Exchange 2007 Transport and Routing Architecture. For more Microsoft webcasts, go to microsoft.com/webcast. I would now like to hand it over to today's presenter, Harold Wong. Harold, you now have the floor.
Thank you very much, Eric, and thank you everyone for coming in and participating in this webcast. Also want to thank a few folks on the back end, Scott Schnoll from the Exchange Product Group, as well as Vero, my teammate, who are busily answering your questions and are awaiting your questions. So go ahead and ask away, and they will do their best to keep up. I will ask that you please be patient, as there are over 200 folks on, and there's only 2 people answering questions. At the very end of the webcast, if there are still any questions in the queue, I will finish them off in the Q&A panel, so that I can capture all the questions and all the answers. And just like I did with Friday's webcast, I will go ahead and post it to my blog. So if you don't have my blog address, go ahead and write that down. It is right here, blogs.technet.com/Harold Wong. And no, there are no storms in Phoenix today. It's bright and sunny, has been for the last few days, so we shouldn't have any power problems today. Let's go ahead and jump into part 2. With the short time I have, I want to make sure that we don't waste any pure precious moments. In today's session, I'm going to go ahead and cover the routing and go over some of the topologies for Exchange 2007. Because when you look at the routing piece of Exchange now in 2007, it is very AD site centric, and it depends on some of the core components that's built into your topology as it relates to AD. So we want to cover off on that and then look at how Exchange builds on top of that component. It's always helpful if you have some experience with our technologies, and this is the same slide you'll see every single time. And as I mentioned previously, if you joined on Fridays, the level is going to be somewhere between 100, 150 to 200, depending on the actual topic that's going to be covered on each slide. And the reason is, for some of you, when I go into, say, AD, it might be 100 level. For some of you, it might be 200. As I dig into maybe the transport piece specific to Exchange, it jumps up to 200. So it's going to be a mix. And do understand that we are doing an hour each time, so we're building. So if you're already familiar with some of the basics, I do ask for your patience. As I said, we are building a whole set, so I have to build the groundwork first, and then we'll get into the more advanced topics as we move along. As we always do with these webcast series, we usually start with the review, so I will start with the review, and then we will move into the actual topologies and the transport and routing. So if you look at what I covered on Friday, we were looking at some of the integration of Exchange into AD. So we looked at just some of the server roles, some of the permissions, the administrative roles, how you delegate permissions, and so forth. Rather than asking you poll questions, I took the 9 questions that were asked throughout on Friday, and I just put them up over here at the beginning so that we can go over some of the key points. So when we integrate with AD, just know that we were looking at making sure it was flexible, that we had trustworthiness, so security, as well as scalability, whether we look at the 64-bit piece of Exchange, the fact that it is 64-bit, or the fact that we have all these different roles that can scale out so that you can install Exchange on different servers to perform different tasks. We did not want to make it more complex. We wanted to make it more simple. That's why complexity was the wrong answer. If you look at the next question, we looked at single force, cross force, and resource force for the topologies for Exchange as how it interacts with AD. I'm going to go into this just a little bit more again in this webcast, but when you look at a resource force, that's where you say, okay, I want to make sure that my AD administration is totally separate than that of Exchange. If that's the case, then you would create a separate force, install Exchange into that resource force. That way all your Exchange administrators administer Exchange, and only Exchange-related stuff, and there's no cross possibilities, right, where your domain admins are going to be doing anything with your Exchange stuff. So that's 2 separate force, but Exchange is only installed in one of those force. Versus a cross force, which has Exchange in both force. When you look at the different roles within Exchange, there are going to be communication mechanisms. And if I do have a cross-force infrastructure where I have multiple force and each one of those has Exchange installed into it, the odds are you will have edge transport server role set up to do the communication between them. Now, please keep in mind if you don't have edge, you can always set up just the hub transport as the communication mechanism, but we will always recommend that edge be put in because that is best practices from our standpoint. When you look at the planning and you say, okay, where in AD does Exchange 2007 store all of its information? This was very similar to what Exchange 2003 and 2000 did. Right, so it's going to store information in your AD partitions. The schema partition has all the object classifications, the attributes that we can store. Configuration partition will contain all the information related to Exchange itself in terms of, as an example, the hub transport rules. That information is stored in the partition, the configuration partition. And then all the recipient information, well, that's in the domain partition. When you look at the user objects, well, the user objects are mail-enabled, and there's going to be attributes associated with those objects. Well, that's part of the domain partition. So when you look at all of those pieces, Exchange Server 07 uses all of them. If I go to the next slide, if you look at how Exchange 2007 does the routing, and that's what I'm going to dig into a little bit more in this session, is it takes advantage of your AD site topology. So as you define the cost for an IP site link between different AD sites, Exchange does take a look at that cost when it calculates the lowest cost link. Right? So it does use the cost of an IP link. At the same time, if I have multiple sites and the way I define my site topology in AD, it doesn't necessarily mean that Exchange will try to always hop from hub transport to hub transport to hub transport to deliver a message. It will always try to deliver directly to the end hub transport server, but taking advantage of the site topology in terms of the traffic flow. And if I go to the next one, if you look at the different predefined admin groups within Exchange 2007, there were 4 of them. Right? There was, if you look, there's the Exchange Recipient Administrator, Exchange View Only, Exchange Organization, and what was the other one? Exchange, brain fart. By the way, there's 4, and if I could just remember what they are right now, I would say them, and for whatever reason, I'm having a hard time today. But we'll get past that. I'll bring that back up a little bit later here. Actually, here they are. So you look at the Organization Administrator, Recipient Administrator, Server Administrator, and View Only Administrator. So if you look at the ones that, or the particular one that only allows you to manage recipient objects, well then that's the Recipient Administrator. A Server Administrator, you can only administer server-specific attributes or settings, versus the Organization Administrator can do everything. Right? And then of course View Only is just that. They can only view the settings but not actually set anything. And then the final review piece was things that, or the permissions required to manage just a given server or that don't apply to the entire organization. And I mentioned that earlier, that's the Exchange Server Administrator. Right? Because when I look at a Recipient Administrator, that person could administer recipient information for the entire organization. Whereas if I look at the Server Administrator, it's only going to administer server-specific stuff. Alrighty, so with that review, hopefully we are all still okay. Let's go ahead and jump into the actual agenda for this webcast. And the first piece we're going to get into is exploring the 2007 topologies. So if we look first at Exchange 2003, because it's always good to know or remember where we came from and where we're going to, right? So when you look at Exchange 2003, we had routing groups. And routing groups were there to define the collection of servers, Exchange servers, that had, say, high bandwidth connectivity so that we can control the mail flow and public folder referrals and public folder replication and so forth. So all Exchange 2003 servers that were in the same routing group, Well, they assumed that they had high bandwidth. They were part of one physical network, right? And they would transfer messages and communicate directly with one another. If you look at the, oh, come on. If you look at the administrative groups, that was your admin model. That's where we split out from the 5.5 world, the site concept. So if I put all my Exchange 2003 servers into one admin group, or if I separate them into 4 different admin groups, it was a way for me to break up who could administer what component or which servers in my environment. And then it could get very complex. It could be very confusing, especially when some administrators would administer different sets of Exchange servers. So they would be administering different administrative groups. And then sometimes what we found a lot of customers did was they just created one admin group and put everybody into it, as well as creating one routing group and putting all the servers into it, because it was difficult to do all of that management around configuring all these different routing groups, and hence why we moved away from this model. If you look at the IMF, right, IMF was part of your Exchange 2003 infrastructure, and it still is part of the Exchange 2007 infrastructure. This is now tied to 2 roles, the main one being the Exchange Edge Transport role. And if you choose not to implement Edge, but you still want IMF and the anti-spam components, then you would install those agents onto your Hub Transport role. So the IMF is now part of the either Hub Transport or Edge Transport roles. If you look at the link state routing, which is what 2003 used, so once again, this is all the legacy stuff. It would take a look and calculate the link state, and if something was down, it would go ahead and recalculate and publish the new link state information out so that messages would be rerouted down a different channel based on the routing groups that you used. And we've moved away from that component in 2007 because it is no longer necessary. We are using AD site-based routing rather than calculating our own link state within Exchange. If you look at routing objects, once again, because Exchange 2003 did its own routing calculation, there were different routing objects it took advantage of. And once again in 2007, because we are AD site-based, we no longer need to define our own routing objects and configure those routing objects, those routing connectors and so forth, because it's automatic and takes advantage of what AD sites has already defined for us. Right? So kind of taking a look at where we were in 2003 and moving to 2007. So in 2007 we have one routing group, one admin group, even though technically, as far as I'm concerned, the way I look at it is they're gone, but we do have it there for backward compatibility. So, but everything essentially sits in one routing group. Everything sits in one admin group. And when you look at the routing, the Hub Transport server role is responsible for querying in to AD and looking at the AD site topology for how that routing configuration takes place. If you look at the different topologies for Exchange, we break those into 3 categories here. So if you look at the first one being the logical, come on, advance. The logical topology is essentially taking a look at the different forest designs that we support in Exchange, right? And I talked about that earlier. That's where we look at a single forest versus multiple forests or cross forests, a dedicated Exchange resource forest. Right? So those are the logical topologies that I'm referring to. If we go and look at our, I guess I built too fast, but physical topologies, then the physical is where you're going to actually place your servers, or looking at where might I place servers. Am I going to go with a single server, a multiple server deployment? Do I have multiple sites? Do I have a centralized server environment or centralized administration and so forth? Because then you do look at where people physically sit. You take a look at the bandwidth connections and you decide how many servers, placement of servers, which then leads us to the overall Exchange organization topology, which is really looking at all of those aspects from a physical and a logical perspective. Right? How is my AD site topology defined? How is my DNS architecture defined? Where are my domain controllers? What about SMTP and so on and so forth? So there's a lot of different aspects when you look at the overall Exchange organization topology. And of course over here I have a slide that kind of goes into each of these topologies individually. And I've talked about the logical topology already. We did this on Friday briefly as well. And in this case, you do want to take a look at your edge transport role and how it fits into a single force versus a resource force and cross force, as well as hub transport. But either way, the key here is, am I going to deploy a single force topology, in which case I only have one Exchange organization? Or am I going to deploy multiple force with multiple Exchange orgs, and then I have to make sure that I have connectivity between those? Am I going to do the resource force because I need separation of administration from Exchange versus AD? If I look at my physical topologies, then it's a matter of where physically do my servers sit? Am I going to go with a centralized messaging? Come on, advance. Am I going to go with a centralized messaging type topology, or am I going to go distributed? Right, so if you have a lot of high bandwidth connectivity points between all your different sites and your different user locations, then perhaps you might want to look at a centralized messaging topology where you put all your messaging servers or Exchange servers in one central area. And if you look at Microsoft, we are pretty much going with a centralized messaging topology where all of our Exchange servers sit in one of 3 data centers throughout the entire world, right, globally. So it's still centralized messaging, but because it's a global organization, we can't centralize to just one main data center. Versus the distributed messaging systems is where I have all my branch offices, and I'm going to put an Exchange server in each one of those because I have such poor bandwidth between all of those sites and my main site. And when you look at most organizations and what they did with Exchange 5.5, and that includes Microsoft, by the way, we had a distributed messaging system where every field office pretty much had their own Exchange 5.5 server. And we had Exchange servers just spread throughout the entire world, all over the place, hundreds and hundreds of Exchange servers. Well, you need to take a look at your bandwidth capabilities, and then as you look to move to Exchange 2007, look and say, do I go with the centralized, or do I still go with a distributor or a mix, right? I'm going to centralize where it makes sense, but I'll still put out Exchange servers in the field offices where it does make sense to have the servers out there. And no matter what you choose to do, make sure that you do all of this with service level management in mind. Right? What's your SLA to your customers? And your customers are your end users and the business owners, to make sure that they have either the snappiness of service when they're checking email, or if a server does go down, that you can bring up another server, or if a link goes down, that users can somehow get access to their email, because we know that email today is definitely mission critical in most organizations. And then when you look at your Exchange server organization topology, now that breaks down into a couple of different things. So let me get this to build out. We've got your network layer, and when you look at network layer, that is both physical and logical. Right? So when I'm looking at my IP subnets, my IP addresses, or the LAN connection speeds versus the WAN links versus my routers and the firewalls, if I've got branch offices that connect via a dial-on-demand VPN type scenario, or point-to-point, is it an appliance that sits out there? What kind of bandwidth do they have? Right? That's all the physical layer piece, but it's very important for how you design connectivity or design where you place your Exchange servers and what client you end up using. From a logical perspective, you also need to take a look at your DNS zones and your ADs, how's AD site topology set up. But there's both that physical and logical piece of the network layer. Taking a look at AD in more specifics, then you look at how AD is configured. Do you have a single domain? Do you have multiple domains? Do you have domains that cross multiple sites? Do you have one site that cross multiple domains? However you want to look at that. Where are my domain controllers located? Where are my global catalog servers? What about my AD site topology? Did I configure that appropriately? Did I define the costs associated with all my AD sites? Because all of that will come into play and will affect how the user's experience is. It will affect your ability to recover from a loss of a link or a loss of a server. Right? And that is definitely important, especially, hopefully none of that ever happens, but should that ever come across or something ever break, you need to make sure that you can meet your SLAs to the organization. So when you look at that topology, it's taking a look at your network layer, taking a look at your AD layer and how they all interact, and making sure that you design your server placements based on high bandwidth or low bandwidth and your clients that you're going to use, and so on and so forth, so that everything meshes together nicely. Right? If you're going to have a lot of public folders and you're going to replicate the public folders, well then you need to understand the latency between replication of those public folders. Or what about configuring and deploying LCR or CCR, right? Which is the local continuous replication and clustered continuous replication. Where do I put those components, and how is that going to affect the bandwidth or the network latency issues? How's that all going to tie in, and so on and so forth? Where do I put CAS servers? Where do I put my hub transport servers? Right? That all ties into how your network is laid out and how your AD environment is laid out. So those are definitely very important aspects as you look to deploy Exchange. Most people take that for granted, and I know I'm probably one of those sometimes, but this is something that is definitely important. So let's see if I yacked away correctly and made things clear. So when let's take a look at 3 review questions. You'll notice there's a trend to this, but I have 3 questions. The first one is, when you look at the physical layer of the Exchange topology, what is it describing? Right? Is it describing where servers are located, or how my public folders are going to replicate, how the mail is being transported from one site to the other? Or is it all of those? Does it take into account all of those pieces? And I've got well over 200 people, over 250 people logged in. I would like to get at least 50% participation. Make sure people are paying attention. And there we go. We jumped above 50% for sure now. So let me show you the results. And the answer is all of the above. Right? Because that physical topology, when you look at it, is where am I going to place the servers, which then affects the public folder replication, that affects how my mail is being transported. And so I know I covered that, but I gave you the broad brush picture. So let's go to the next question. And I forgot to really highlight this one piece, didn't I? So we'll see if you guys get this one right. So in Exchange 2007, we know there are different roles, of which UM is one, Hub Transport's another, Edge Transport is yet a third. There's a few more that I'm not listing, but which one of these does not require AD? And I'm going to help you out. It is not the 4th option. So it's going to be one of those roles. So go ahead and cast your vote. So everybody that voted the green one, which is all server roles require at least one AD for us, you can go ahead and stop answering that one. So let me go ahead and show you the results. And looks like most of you did indeed get it right. It is the Edge Transport server role. That one does not require Active Directory to install. All right? It does not require force. It installs in the DMZ. It can be a member of a domain, but it would be a domain that sits in the DMZ for DMZ server management. It is not a member of your production AD forced environment. So even though it could be a member, it does not require it. Everything is installed and configured via Atom, which is stored locally on that server. Even if it is a member of the domain in the DMZ, it still stores its configuration information in its local copy of Atom. So let's go ahead and move to the 3rd question and take a look. Oh, this is the answer. So Edge Transport. Let me go ahead and jump to the 3rd question. When you look at the logical topologies of Exchange 2007, and you're trying to determine, where, I guess I should just read the question, right? Which logical topology deploys multiple servers across multiple AD domains? So take a look at this. And it's a tricky question, okay? I'm going to tell you that. It is a tricky question. So think about the 3 different forest topologies that are listed and think, can I have multiple AD domains with multiple Exchange servers in them? And that should give you an idea of what the answer is. So I'll give it another few seconds. I want to get over 50%, and it looks like we're at about 50%. So here we go. Most of you are guessing cross-forest topology, but let me ask you this. If I have a single forest, can I have 10 domains? And in each of those domains, can I have an Exchange server? If I have a resource forest, could I have 10 domains in that forest and have an Exchange server in each of those domains? The same question goes for the cross forest. And the answer to that is going to be yes across the board. So the answer is indeed all of the above. All right? Because what I just said, when you look at the logical topology, regardless of whether you're single forest, resource forest, or cross forest, each forest can have multiple domains, and each domain could have an Exchange server installed. That was a tricky question, but wanted to make sure everybody understood that principle. So now let's go ahead and jump into the last agenda item, which is the transport and routing. And I do have a demo, and it's part of this piece here where we actually get a look at how we now do the transport rules and SMTP and so on and so forth. So let's jump into this first slide. Oops, it all built out on me, didn't it? Oh well. Let's come back over here. Is somebody clicking? Is that what happened? Oh well, such is life. If I look at the transport server roles, there are 2 transport server roles. Right? One is the hub transport. The other is the edge transport. And remember, I'm going to make sure this is clear because I tend to get a lot of questions on this. The edge transport role is not required. It is 100% optional. Okay? It is recommended that you do implement the edge transport server role, but remember, it is not required. Okay? I get that question all the time. So now when you take a look, let's start with the hub transport here. The hub transport server role is responsible for that message transport and routing. Right? So it's going to go ahead, and this is the one that sits inside your network in the corporate environment, and it will go ahead and calculate and figure out where your mailbox is and deliver the message appropriately. Right? That's the transport, that's the routing. It also is where all the transport rules are associated. So when I create a compliancy rule that says messages with this type of text is not allowed, or I want to go ahead and force a disclaimer on all my emails, well, that's going to be handled by the hub transport server role. Right? And that's the messaging policy and compliance piece. And that's your internal environment. Right? So the hub transport, you would never, ever, ever, ever install that into the DMZ. You would always install that on your corporate network inside your environment. Right? So it's going to message, or it's going to move all the messages. It's going to be where you install your antivirus engine so that they get scanned in transport. All your journaling policies get put in here, and so on and so forth. Right? That's the hub transport server role. The other one is the edge transport server role, and that's going to sit in the DMZ. You don't install that on the internal network. Well, I guess you could, but then you'd still have to allow messages to flow into it in order for it to deliver to your hub transport server role. But the edge transport server role is going to do the message transport and routing as well, right? Because it's going to accept email coming in from the internet, and it's going to route it and deliver it internally to the hub transport server role. It's going to look up recipient information if you've turned on all of the edge sync stuff and configured every aspect of the edge transport. Well, then it's going to go ahead and do a look at the transporting and the routing and making sure that it gets sent on internally appropriately. If you've turned on anti-spam, which is very hopeful that you do, and antivirus, then it can do all the scanning out here with the integration with the Outlook junk email safe senders list, the anti-spam has that much more capability built in on the edge transport. And before anything passes to the hub transport internally, the edge will have cleansed and performed the majority of your message hygiene. So if you're like Microsoft and you get 80 to 90% junk emails coming in from the internet, then all of that gets dropped out on the DMZ before it comes into the corporate network. Right? On the edge transport server role, though, it does not do any of those hub transport type policies. So you're not going to define a policy on the edge transport that does, checking for content in terms of these two people can't send a message to each other if it has this content or content in it. You're not going to do journaling on the edge transport server role. So it's not going to do that message compliancy like the hub transport server role does. The two of these do communicate and do talk to each other. So if you look at the edge sync, which is the replication of information as it relates to recipient information from AD out to the edge, the hub transport does that via the edge sync capability. Right? When the hub transport delivers email out to the internet, well, it's going to pass it to the edge transport, which delivers to the internet. When the edge transport receives an email from the internet, it's going to pass it to the hub transport internally for delivery to the mailbox. So these two do work hand in hand together. But once again, remember, edge transport is not required. It is still considered optional. So with that in mind, if you choose not to implement the edge transport, but you still want the anti-spam and antivirus, then you would need to install your anti-spam agents onto your hub transport role, which you can indeed do. There is a script that you would run, and it would go ahead and install all those agents onto your hub transport server so that you can configure and manage it on the hub transport. So let's move on to the next slide, which is which is talking about the new SMTP transport stack. And I believe I briefly mentioned this on Friday, but the key here is rather than depending on the core SMTP stack that comes with IIS on Windows Server 2003, we are no longer dependent upon that. And when you do that, then you no longer have to be dependent upon IIS itself. And that's the goal, especially when you look at the edge transport server role. If you're going to install that into the DMZ, most organizations say, well, we don't want to install IIS. But if we're going to depend on if we're going to build on SMTP stack that comes with IIS, which is part of Windows, then you have to install IIS. So in order to avoid doing that, we've built our own SMTP stack within Exchange, and that SMTP stack is managed by the Exchange Transport Services. Right, so there's a new service. It's called the Microsoft Exchange Transport Service, and that's where the SMTP protocol is located. And we don't need IIS in terms of SMTP. So when you go to install Exchange, which we'll get into in part 4, I believe it is, installing Exchange, instead of having to install SMTP and NNTP like you did in Exchange 2003, it's now you must not install SMTP and NNTP when you go to install Exchange 2007 onto that server. All right? So it is managed directly by Exchange, and when you look at that SMTP stack, it's got different receive agents and different agents that manage different aspects of the overall communication. So you can have you can configure, and I'll show this in the demo, different receive connectors that allow you to receive emails from clients versus communication for internal only versus internal to external, so that you can define different mechanisms for how that communication actually occurs. All right, so remember, in Exchange 2007, we now have a new SMTP transport stack. It is part of the Exchange Transport Service, and you no longer want to install SMTP that comes with IIS on Server 03. Right? It is its own piece. So the comment I've received is, finally, now we've gone back to kind of like the Exchange 5.5 environment where the Exchange group controls and defines that SMTP stack. which some people like that idea better than depending on the Windows one. So it depends on how you look at it, but either way, that's what we have now. So let's go ahead and take a look at how all of this comes into play when we look at our AD environment and how messages are routed. If you look at this AD topology, each circle represents an AD site, and then the gray link represents the link between those sites. And in this AD environment, you can see we've got a hub site, essentially, which is our Chicago site, versus the New York and Seattle. So as far as AD is concerned, the site topology, the routing or the replication is always going to go through the Chicago site. When we take a look at how Exchange fits into that, advance please. If we have an Exchange server, a hub transport server in the New York site and an Exchange hub transport server in the Seattle site, then they will direct relay to each other, right? But it will take advantage of the network topology defined. So it's going to, of course, from the network perspective, the physical perspective, it probably traverses the link through Chicago, right? That's from a physical perspective, because usually you define your AD sites based on the physical topology. But the key here is the two servers will always directly relay between each other, right? So it's going to communicate directly from one to the other. It's not going to try to deliver it to the Chicago site first. That, I guess, is the key I'm trying to bring out here. Now, if you want, you can still configure a hub site within Exchange 2007. So if I did have a hub transport in the Chicago site, I could set it up as the hub site. So I could define the Chicago site as the hub site and always ensure that emails are routed through the hub site. Okay, so I could do that. At the same time, if I do have, and I know before I built this out, I did not have a hub transport server in Chicago, but let's just say I did. And now that you see both or all three servers, I have a hub transport in New York, wrong one, hub transport in New York, in Chicago, and in Seattle. But I don't configure the Chicago hub transport as a hub site, then emails going from New York to Seattle will still be direct, right? The hub transport in New York will still go directly to the hub transport in Seattle. It's not going to route through the hub site in Chicago unless I define it as a hub site. Hopefully I made that clear and I'm not confusing anyone. Right? One thing to keep in mind about this is in this new topology, if a link does go down and two sites cannot communicate, then the email on this hub transport will queue up until it is able to communicate with that Seattle site. In my example, let's say Seattle, for whatever reason, the link goes down and New York hub transport cannot communicate with the Seattle hub transport, then it will queue messages until that communication path comes back, versus trying to recalculate the site topology and try to find a different route. So because we are no longer having these routing group connectors and calculating all that within Exchange, the way the points of failure occur is different, right? So we will now queue at the server where it's trying to go out until that path comes back and is available again. So that is different in 2007. Also over here, notice that in AD, what we're referring to here is that in AD I do define a cost to that IP site link, and Exchange will by default use that. However, if I would like to have an Exchange cost that's different than the AD site cost, I can assign that. And that question, by the way, was asked in the Friday webcast, so I did post the answer in my Q&A log on how you would actually change that cost. And I will actually demo that here for you in just a minute. Right, and this is just the build out that shows if there's a link that's down, the message just gets queued at the point of failure until that link comes back up. So let's build to the next one. And when we look at SMTP connectors, when you install Exchange, there are going to be implicit connectors that will automatically look at all the 80 site pieces, will adhere to them, and kind of fit in with it. Just remember, for every 80 site in which you deploy a mailbox server, you must also, or server role, you must also deploy at least one hub transport server role. You could have 2 or more for redundancy, but at least 1 for email to flow in and out of that particular 80 site from the mailbox servers. Right, very important thing to keep in mind. Now, from a receive connector, there's always going to be a built-in default receive connector to receive emails, whether it be from the internet or from other Exchange servers. And there's always going to be the send connector. But the point I want to bring out here is you could define different ones and configure them differently in how they behave for internally routed emails versus emails going to and from the internet. So let's go ahead and take a look at that real quick, because I'm sure everybody has a question on how you actually configure that. So let's go look. Let me unlock my machine. Hopefully everybody does see my Exchange server. It has that nice Exchange logo, and it says Exchange Server 2007 on the desktop. So if I come over here to my Exchange Management Console, if I go look at the server configuration, hub transport, right, because I am configuring a particular server, not the entire organization, I can see that on this server I have 2 receive connectors defined. And these are default right out of the box. So if I were to look at the properties of the default connector, you can see the name here. You can look at network settings in terms of what IP addresses it's going to accept, as well as received email. If I look at authentication mechanisms, right, I'm seeing that I'm going to use TLS. So if I select TLS, it will attempt to do TLS, especially if I choose in this setting here to only offer basic after TLS. Right? Exchange server authentication, so it's going to try to use a Exchange server mechanism, which is TLS or Kerberos, something that's secure. I can also take advantage of integrated Windows authentication. But remember, this is the default, so all internal communications will use this, as well as external communications, perhaps, depends on how you set it up. But you can always come in and define different connectors and then define how they interact, right? Who's allowed to use it. And on this one, you can see that all Exchange users, all Exchange servers, as well as the legacy Exchange servers, which is the 2003 and previous, which is really 2003 and 2000, from the security groups and how they're defined from a 03 versus 07 perspective, right? But if I were to look at the client connector that was defined, if I look at authentication, you'll see it's pretty much similar, but there's no server authentication because this is for client communication. On the permission, it says Exchange users. Right? Now, what if I wanted to define a new connector that I'm going to use for communication with a partner environment? So let's say partner connector. I can choose to select one of these predefined definitions of the connector. And let me just show you what it does. Right? So if I click Partner here and click Next, I would put in, what is this called, nwtraders.com. Click Next. Select my IP settings and remote and the network settings. So I'll go ahead and accept the defaults for those. Whoops. It would be nice if, what did I do wrong? I must have done something wrong here, so let's just go back. Probably put in the wrong, oh, I didn't have a, let's cancel out. Let's copy that. So let's go ahead and create a new one now. Actually, I'll do this one as Internet. Let's just do that. Go to the Internet, click Next. Put in my fully qualified domain name. And why is it failing? Oh, because I already have a connector that does the same thing. Well, duh. So got to read my error messages correctly, but the idea here is I would probably need to change, or I can change different things around, and on my edge transport I would probably configure one type of connector. The idea here I want to bring out is you could actually set up, oh, I don't want to do that. I could actually set up different connectors that define how communications interact. So if this one's a specific one for partners, I could define that and go in and have different rules that define how I actually communicate with my partner community, right? In terms of they're always going to use TLS. I'm going to define the domain, partner domain namespaces that I'm going to communicate with for those partners. So that's the hub transport and configuring that piece of it. Some of the items that you may want to configure are not necessarily available in the GUI aspect. So remember, in the deck itself I said that you could configure the hub transport to use a different cost associated with the site link. So let me go ahead and bring up my Exchange command shell and just show you some of the commands that are available. Let me just do this. So if I do a get receive connector, that's going to go ahead and get the list of receive connectors that are defined and whether they're enabled or not. Right, so I can at least get information. I can also set information on that connector from the command shell. I can also get information as it relates to my 80 sites. Right, and I can see I only have one site, which is a default first hub site. And notice that is not defined as a hub site. The setting here is false. I can also choose to get a site link. So let me auto tab complete here. I can see I've got one default IP site link, or the name is default IP site link. It has an AD cost of 100, and the exchange cost is not defined. So of course it's just going to use what the AD cost is. If I wanted to set this cost for exchange to be something different, I could. And I would, instead of using the get to get information, I would choose the set. So let me tab complete, AD site link. So I would set the AD site link for, making sure I type correctly, the default IP site link. And I would assign it an exchange cost of, let's say, 10. So now if I get AD site link information, you'll see that the exchange cost is 10, whereas my AD cost is 100. So I've set it to be a lower cost. Right? Maybe I want to set this to be a higher cost. But either way, these types of settings, if you want to change them, are only done or able to be done via the command shell and not the command console. So please keep that in mind. I can also get information such as my transport config. So I can take a look at all my transport configuration settings for dumpster size, dumpster time. I can get information as it relates to transport server, right, and find out which transport server I have, whether message tracking is enabled, and so on and so forth. But the key I'm trying to point out here is if you want to make some of the changes or you want to configure your transport, you can do some of those components within the command console, which is the GUI interface. But others you will have to do via the command shell, which is the command interface. So you're going to need to, if you want to do some of these more advanced configuration settings, then you will need to go to the command shell to accomplish them. All right. Hopefully this does help if this is something you're interested in. And that is my basic demo for configuring routing. Right, so I took a look at the hub transport settings, and I showed you how to configure some of those settings as it relates to the PowerShell. Right, so remember, not all things are done via the GUI. Some are done through the PowerShell. And with that, let's go ahead and ask some review questions. Right, 3 of them as it relates to what I just finished covering. So if you look at the administrative model for Exchange 2007, what did we introduce? Right, and I talked about it. There's those 4 different, there's the administrator, server, recipient, and view only. Right? Those are, and most of you are getting that correct. Those are called roles. Right? So it's role-based administration. And there's the answer. Let's go to the next question here. Which of the following is not the task of the Edge Transport Server role? Hopefully I made this quite clear in terms of what it is responsible for versus what it is not responsible for. And it is not exactly the same as the hub transport. So remember, this is the edge, not the hub. And if I look at the results or show the results, most of you are indeed getting it correct. It is the last option, which is messaging, policy, and compliance. Right? It is there to do the transport and routing of messages, and especially anti-spam and antivirus, that hygiene piece before it ever enters your organization. And then the last review question is, when we look at Exchange 2007, what service actually handles the SMTP protocol? And hopefully everybody will get this one right. So far we're at 100% correct. Just waiting for a few more of you to vote. Oh, it dropped below 100%. Let's go ahead and show the results. You can see that the majority of you are indeed getting it right. It is the Exchange Transport Service, right, which is new to Exchange 2007. We no longer need IIS for SMTP. Now, you still need to install IIS on the server, but it's not for SMTP. All right, so there's a difference in terms of a mailbox server, client access server, and so on. And with that, I have 25 minutes after the hour. We are at the end of this particular session where we talked about the different topologies as it relates to logical and physical, and we looked at how Exchange 2007 takes advantage of that from a transport perspective. Right? So the key here is going into the hub transport and going into the edge transport. Right? And we will dig a little bit more into each of those roles and how to configure how the interaction between the hub transport and the edge transport in a much later session. Right? So please be patient. I know that as I go through each one of these parts, I'm only covering one small piece of the overall picture, and I can't get into everything, otherwise we would be here for hours upon hours upon hours to get everything done all in one session. Hence why it's broken up into 24 different sessions. So with that, I do want to thank you for your time in attending. And I do want to thank Scott and Vero, who have been busy answering all the questions on the back end. And I will go ahead and grab the Q&A log after I finish answering all these questions in the panel. And I will post it to my blog. So stay tuned for that. And if you have any questions, feel free to ask away. You can always email me at harold.wong@microsoft.com. And now that I've officially covered off on this piece here, I do want, Eric, before I turn it over to you, I want to go show you one little thing to correct a little snafu from Friday. Let me unlock my machine here. If I can type correctly, I can unlock my machine. I did want to show you that from Friday, if you go back and view on demand, you'll notice that I did bring out or brought forward a group in my AD environment that has actually been changed at RTM. So I was looking at I didn't realize I was using one of my beta copies or beta images. So I went ahead and booted up my RTM image. And this is a Exchange Legacy Interop group versus saying Exchange, I believe, 2003 Interop or something. So there's a few minor changes in terms of how we introduce some of the groups and so forth. But know that if you've been playing with the beta of Exchange and then you finally get your hands on the RTM code of Exchange, some of the UI pieces will probably be different depending on the version of the beta you were playing with, right, or that you were experimenting with. So understand that at RTM we did make some changes, and I hope and encourage you to take some time in your lab to go through the RTM code of Exchange before you actually deploy into production. So did want to point that one little errata out, so hopefully everybody's okay with that. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to Eric and let him close up the session. So thank you everybody again for taking time to attend.
Okay, thank you, Harold. I am going to put up the survey here in a moment. I encourage you to fill it out. As a little incentive, by attending this live webcast and submitting the evaluation, you will be entered to win a 30 gigabyte Zune digital media player. So I'm going to put the survey up here and give you all a chance to fill it out. In addition to being entered into the drawing, it does give us valuable feedback for building the rest of these presentations. We are on part 2 of 24, so if you've got any comments when you fill out the survey, there is a comment section there. We do read those. If there's something you wanted to see more of, let us know. If there's something you really like, let us know that too. Harold, we've got a couple minutes left here. Would you be able to take some of these questions via...
I'd rather go ahead and answer them in the panel so that I capture everything as correctly as possible so that I can post the answer onto my blog.
Perfect. So we will be answering your questions via text, so just stand by for that. But I do want to thank Harold for presenting today, and thank you everyone for attending today's webcast. That concludes today's TechNet webcast. You may now disconnect from the audio portion of this conference.